Europe, 1944. The air above the Ardennes trembles with sound. Not thunder, but engines. Rolls-Royce Merlins and Daimler-Benz 605s tear at the winter sky, their exhausts streaking pale trails across the frozen blue. Below, the forest burns. Above, men duel in machines that history would later call beautiful. A Spitfire banks hard, its elliptical wings catching the light like a blade. A P-51 Mustang rises to meet a Messerschmitt 109 diving from the sun. They twist and roll in vapor and silence, two pilots locked in a dance older than reason. Both believe their aircraft is the finest ever built. Both are wrong, though neither will live long enough to know why. Propaganda fills the airwaves even faster than the fighters themselves. In London, posters call the Spitfire the savior of freedom. In Berlin, the Messerschmitt is hailed as the angel of vengeance. Each nation feeds its people a myth that technology, not endurance, decides the fate of men. Newspapers count kills like victories in a sport. Engineers become celebrities. The truth, meanwhile, is hidden beneath a tide of national pride and selective memory. For every ace who claims supremacy, there are dozens shot down by chance, by weather, by radio error, by the simple fatigue of war. Statistics, when stripped of emotion, tell a colder story. Kill ratios rarely matched propaganda, and performance was as much about altitude and fuel as design or bravery. Yet the legends endure. Even decades later, the myth of the perfect fighter still clouds the truth of what really won the air war: logistics, production, and the grim mathematics of attrition. Pilots fought for honor. Factories decided who survived. The camera pans upward, through the haze of dogfights dissolving into cloud. The narrator's voice softens. History remembers these machines as symbols of glory. But in the numbers they left behind, another story waits, one that would dismantle the myths they died for. In the next chapter, that story begins. Every nation had its champion, a machine elevated beyond steel and rivets, beyond the reach of logic. To Britain, it was the Spitfire, the perfect curve of wing and spirit, born from the urgency of 1940. To America, the P-51 Mustang, sleek, long-legged, capable of crossing the continent of Europe on a single tank of fuel. To Japan, the Zero, light as air, built for grace and sacrifice. To Germany, the Messerschmitt 109, compact, brutal, a spear thrust toward the heavens. And to the Soviet Union, the Yak-3, a blunt, fierce reminder that endurance, not elegance, wins wars. To the civilians who watched them, these aircraft were not weapons, they were art. Newspaper sketches turned them into emblems of national character. The Spitfire was British resilience, the Mustang American innovation, the Zero Japanese devotion. They were stories told in aluminum and paint, reminders that technology could still reflect the soul of a nation. People needed those symbols. They made loss bearable and victory believable. But to the men who flew them, the truth was less romantic. A cockpit was not a pedestal, but a cage. Instruments rattled, oxygen froze, engines seized without warning. The thin skin of aluminum that gleamed in propaganda posters could tear apart with a single burst of cannon fire. The pilots learned quickly that no aircraft was perfect. Some simply failed slower than others. Each legend, when examined closely, revealed its flaws. The Spitfire's short range kept it tied to the island it defended. The Mustang's engine was British. The Zero's agility came at the cost of armor. The Bf-109's narrow undercarriage broke as often as it landed. Even the Yak-3, revered for its toughness, demanded more from its pilots than it could safely return. Speed, range, agility, these were not miracles, they were compromises. Air combat rewarded those who adapted, not those who worshipped design. The sky did not care for myths. It only rewarded learning. And as the war deepened, those who clung to legend would soon face an enemy no aircraft could outfly, the changing nature of air warfare itself. In the next section, that transformation begins. War has many authors, but peace rewrites the story. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the truth did not emerge. It was curated. Wartime secrecy had hidden failures. Post-war pride would bury them deeper still. Every nation needed heroes, not errors. Records that once belonged to military archives became instruments of morale. What could not be celebrated was quietly forgotten. Kill claims, once hurriedly scrawled by exhausted pilots, became sacred numbers in the decades that followed. Squadrons exaggerated tallies. Headquarters smoothed inconsistencies. Newspapers rounded the figures upward. Aces became legends, not by verification, but by repetition. The fog of war was replaced by the glow of public relations. In Germany, Erich Hartmann's 352 victories became the myth of the super ace. In Japan, Saburo Sakai's exploits were printed as parables of devotion. In Britain and America, the truth was gentler, but no less edited. Manufacturers joined the chorus. North American aviation praised the Mustang as the plane that won the war. Supermarine claimed the Spitfire had saved the free world. Each slogan turned engineering into myth, each advertisement smoothing the rough edges of reality. It was easier to sell pride than complexity. Even film played its part. Wartime newsreels transformed chaos into choreography. Dogfights edited into ballets of precision and courage. Smoke trails were staged, gun camera footage, trimmed to show only the moments of triumph. The messy arithmetic of combat, fuel shortages, weather, mechanical failure, was cut away, replaced with a cleaner version of courage. The result was 5 enduring lies, carried through generations. That one plane could decide a war, that one pilot could turn its tide, that speed meant safety, that design meant destiny, and that victory was proof of virtue. Lies born from necessity, sustained by nostalgia. History, like flight, depends on balance, but in the thin air of pride and propaganda, it began to lose lift. And as the myths took hold, few noticed the quiet revolution unfolding in the hangars, where engineers were already building the machines that would make every legend obsolete. In 1941, the world awoke to a new kind of fear. Across the Pacific, the Mitsubishi A6M-0 appeared, fast, graceful, and seemingly invincible. It was light where others were heavy, precise where others were clumsy. Its wings curved with mathematical elegance. Its engine sang with the quiet confidence of innovation. For the first time, the West faced a machine that did not fit its expectations. At Pearl Harbor, the Zero's shadow fell across the morning sun. American aircraft still tied to their hangars were destroyed before their pilots reached the field. Over the Philippines, they arrived again, sweeping aside P-40s and Brewster Buffaloes that could barely climb to meet them. In the skies over Singapore, British Hurricanes found themselves outturned, outclimbed, and outfought. Everywhere the Zero appeared, it seemed to rewrite the laws of flight. Its range, over 1,900 kilometers on internal fuel, allowed it to strike from distances the Allies considered impossible. Its agility, born from the sacrifice of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, made it dance in combat like a living thing. Pilots who faced it often never returned, and those who did described it in terms that bordered on reverence. They called it untouchable, ghostly, the plane that could turn inside thought itself. The Americans studied wreckage pulled from jungles and coastlines, searching for an explanation. But early intelligence misread its construction as proof of technological superiority rather than desperate ingenuity. Few realized that its lightness came from omission. Its pilots carried almost no protection. The Zero's secret was not divine design, but the calculated acceptance of death as part of engineering. In Tokyo, the myth became doctrine. Newspapers called the Zero the divine wind reborn, a modern expression of the samurai spirit. Propaganda reels showed pilots bowing before takeoff, merging nationalism with machinery. Children learned the silhouette by heart. The aircraft was no longer just a weapon. It was a symbol of destiny, proof that Japan's sky was sacred and unassailable. But myths move faster than facts. American newspapers, desperate to explain early defeats, echoed the same awe. Technical journals inflated its speed. Pilots whispered that its turns defied physics. The legend of the Zero spread across oceans, carried not only by victory, but by fear. It became the embodiment of the unknown, the perfect enemy, the perfect excuse. Yet, like all legends, it carried within it the seed of its undoing. The same qualities that made it feared would make it fragile. Its light frame could not evolve with the war that was coming. Its pilots, once irreplaceable, would be lost faster than they could be trained. But in that first year, no one saw its limits. At 10,000 feet above the Pacific, the Zero seemed eternal. But deep in American factories, engineers were already drawing blueprints for the aircraft that would hunt it down. And soon, the myth that began in triumph would end in smoke over the Marianas. By 1942, the sky that once belonged to the Zero began to change. What had seemed divine now revealed the marks of human design and human error. In Burma and China, a small band of American volunteers known as the Flying Tigers began to dismantle the legend piece by piece. Led by Claire Chennault, a former U.S. Army airman turned strategist, they studied the Zero not as a monster to be feared, but as a machine to be understood. From captured wrecks and combat reports, Chennault's men drew the first honest portrait of their enemy. Beneath its elegant skin, the Zero was fragile. It carried no armor around the cockpit. Its fuel tanks were unprotected. A single incendiary round could turn the aircraft into a torch. Even its light frame, once admired for agility, bent under the stress of high-speed dives. What made it graceful also made it mortal. Chennault trained his pilots to see the Zero not as untouchable, but as predictable. He taught them never to dogfight, to dive through, fire once, and escape before the Japanese pilot could turn. Boom and zoom, he called it. The sky ceased to be a dance and became a geometry lesson. Angles, altitude, and timing replaced courage and instinct. In the Pacific, the U.S. Navy learned the same lesson through blood. At Coral Sea, at Midway, at Guadalcanal, American pilots began to adjust. They stopped fighting on the Zero's terms. The new F-4F Wildcats and later F-6F Hellcats could no longer match its turn, but they could outdive and outclimb it. Speed, once secondary, became survival. Each engagement revealed a truth the war had hidden. The Zero's perfection existed only against the unprepared. By 1943, the balance inverted. American kill ratios that once stood at 1-4 turned in their favor. In some campaigns, Navy pilots claimed victories as high as 10-1. The myth of the invincible Zero lingered in the minds of those who faced it, but the data told a colder story. Dominance had died the moment the enemy learned how to think, not just fight. Still, Japan refused to abandon the legend. Factories continued producing the same airframe long after it was obsolete. Propaganda clung to the illusion of supremacy, even as pilots fell from the sky. The Zero, once a symbol of progress, became a relic carried by men asked to die for yesterday's advantage. What began as a miracle of engineering ended as a study in inflexibility. The aircraft had not failed its pilots. The nation that built it had failed to evolve. the cracks had appeared, and through them, the truth escaped. In war, adaptation is the only armor that lasts. And even as Japan clung to its fading myth, a new kind of machine, faster, heavier, unstoppable, was already taking shape in American factories. The Zero's brilliance was never in its perfection. It was in its timing. In 1941, its arrival was a revelation. The Allies were still flying relics of the 1930s, machines born in peace and built for theory. Against them, the Zero's lightness and reach seemed prophetic. Yet what appeared as technological superiority was, in truth, the last echo of a different era, a design optimized for the war that had already passed. Japan entered the Second World War with an air force tuned for offense, not endurance. Its pilots were masters of precision flying, trained for short, decisive battles in skies they expected to control. The Zero embodied that philosophy, swift, elegant, and uncompromising. It won because it arrived before the world had learned how to answer it. But in war, timing is a currency that devalues quickly. By 1943, the same traits that once made the Zero legendary turned it into a liability. America's factories, guided by pragmatism rather than pride, adapted at a pace Japan could not match. New aircraft, the Hellcat, the Corsair, the Lightning, emerged faster than Japan could replace its losses, each one heavier, tougher, and capable of absorbing the punishment the Zero could not. In the span of 2 years, the hunter became the hunted. Industrial stagnation, not courage, decided the outcome. Japan's manufacturing base was built on craftsmanship, an art of the few. America's was built on replication, the power of the many. Every lost Zero required hands that could not be replaced. Every fallen pilot took years of experience with him. The empire that once conquered the Pacific skies found itself trapped by its own philosophy, perfection without evolution. Pride made the trap invisible. Engineers who proposed heavier designs were ignored. Commanders clung to the myth that agility could still triumph over speed, that honor could substitute for armor. The result was inevitable. By 1944, the same aircraft that had ruled the Pacific was hopelessly outdated, unable to keep pace with the war it had helped define. Yet even as the tide turned, Japan continued to believe that the Zero spirit would prevail. Factories rebuilt it, pilots praised it, propaganda called it eternal. But metal does not share belief. The skies over the Marianas, over Leyte, over Okinawa, proved the truth. Perfection is fragile, and myths cannot outfly physics. The Zero's real story is not one of failure, but of limitation. The moment when excellence without adaptation meets the future it cannot survive. Its creators had mistaken success for destiny, and destiny for permanence. The lesson endures. In war, survival belongs not to the flawless, but to the flexible. And even as the Zero fell from the sky, a new generation of aircraft, faster, heavier, and jet-powered, was already whispering the next truth of the air age. It is the shape most people still imagine when they think of the war in the air: the long nose, the slender wings, the roar that rose like a hymn, the supermarine Spitfire, graceful, fast, iconic. Its silhouette alone seemed to hold the promise that civilization could still look elegant even when defending itself from destruction. To Britain, the Spitfire was more than a machine. It was a symbol. When the summer of 1940 brought the German Luftwaffe over English skies, the nation looked upward and saw its reflection in metal. The Spitfire embodied youth, courage, and the illusion of invincibility. Newspapers called it Britain's shining sword. Painters turned it into poetry. Politicians spoke its name as if it were a prayer. It was modernity with wings, a miracle of engineering that carried the burden of hope. Yet the truth was quieter. In the Battle of Britain, the Spitfire was rare. Fewer than 1 in 3 RAF fighters was a Spitfire. The rest were Hawker Hurricanes, slower, sturdier, less photogenic. Where the Spitfire dazzled the public, the Hurricane carried the war. It flew from grass fields, patched with canvas and fuel leaks, maintained by overworked ground crews who had neither time nor glamour. In combat, it took the brunt of the fighting, intercepting bombers while the sleeker Spitfires chased their escorts. The arithmetic tells the story the poetry forgets. Of the 1,733 German aircraft lost in that fateful summer, most fell to Hurricanes, not Spitfires. Pilots called them the working man's fighter. They lacked the elegance of their sibling, but absorbed damage the Spitfire could not. Where the Spitfire required precision, the Hurricane forgave mistakes. It was slower, yes, but it was dependable, and dependability, in war, is a rarer virtue than speed. Still, the camera favored beauty. The Spitfire's curved wings caught the light like a sculpture. Its engine note, the growling hum of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, stirred something deep in the national psyche. It looked like victory even when defeat seemed possible. The Hurricane, with its blunt nose and fabric fuselage, looked like yesterday's design. And history, as it often does, chose to remember the part that photographed well. After the war, the myth grew larger than the machine. The Spitfire became the central figure in Britain's story of defiance, a reminder that grace could stand against brute force. Memorials bore its image. Films immortalized its pilots. The Hurricane remained a footnote, its quiet endurance overshadowed by the narrative of elegance. Yet those who flew both knew the truth. The Spitfire was a dancer, light and quick, but fragile under pressure. The Hurricane was a boxer, slower to move, but willing to take a hit and keep flying. The difference was philosophical as much as mechanical. One represented aspiration, the other endurance. And in that difference lies the contradiction of Britain's survival. The battle was won not by brilliance, but by resilience. Even its designer, R.J. Mitchell, would not have recognized the legend that grew from his creation. He had built it for function, not worship. But myths rarely belong to their makers. The Spitfire became the face of an idea, that civilization could be defended with elegance, that beauty itself might stand against tyranny. In a war measured by tonnage and attrition, that illusion mattered as much as any statistic. The arithmetic remains unchanged. Hurricanes destroyed the majority of enemy bombers, absorbed the worst of the losses, and guarded the ground that kept Britain alive. Yet history remembers the Spitfire, the beautiful machine, as if beauty itself had carried the day. Perhaps that is the deeper truth. In a war of steel and exhaustion, people needed something that looked like hope. The Spitfire gave it shape, the Hurricane gave it endurance. Together, they became the two halves of survival, one inspiring the fight, the other sustaining it. In the end, the Spitfire won the story, but the Hurricane won the battle. And far to the east, another nation was about to discover that beauty in design could not compensate for the weight of production. A lesson written not in poetry, but in fire. The story most people remember from the summer of 1940 is a simple one. Young men in Spitfires, dueling Messerschmitts above the green fields of England. It is a beautiful story. It is also incomplete. In truth, the Battle of Britain was not a contest of aces, but a system, an industrial, mathematical, and logistical achievement that turned coordination into defense. While Spitfires tangled with the German escorts, it was the slower, humbler Hawker Hurricanes that intercepted the bombers. 3 Hurricanes for every Spitfire took to the air that year. They met the Heinkels and Dorniers head-on. absorbing the weight of destruction aimed at cities and airfields. Their mission was not glory, but endurance. Every engagement followed an invisible script written not by pilots, but by scientists and planners. Radar stations lined the coast, watching the channel with pulses of energy invisible to the eye. From these signals, information flowed through cables and switchboards into darkened rooms, where young women plotted enemy tracks on maps. Fighter Command, under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, turned this data into orders, vectors, altitudes, and intercept times, relayed to squadrons already waiting on the tarmac. The pilots were the final link in a chain of prediction. The myth of the Spitfire, alone in the sky, defending freedom through elegance and courage, erased this machinery of survival. It replaced a system with a symbol, but the truth of Britain's survival lay not in individual heroics, but in algorithmic precision. Each interception was an equation, each victory a proof of planning. Radar, logistics, and centralized command saved the island long before beauty ever took flight. Yet the public, living under blackout and fear, needed faces, not formulas. Propaganda answered that need. Posters showed the gleaming Spitfire, not the radar masts on the cliffs of Dover. Newspapers printed names of aces, not engineers. The mythology of the lone pilot, brave, poetic, immortal, was simpler to believe than the quiet cooperation of thousands of unseen hands. Heroes inspired, systems did not. The Hurricane became the casualty of that narrative. It lacked glamour. Its fabric fuselage looked primitive beside the Spitfire's polished curves. It was slower, less refined, and never filmed in the glow of evening light. Yet it carried the burden of most engagements, patched with bullet holes, repaired overnight, sent up again before dawn. Ground crews loved it for its reliability. Pilots trusted it for its strength. History forgot it for its lack of beauty. Even Dowding's command structure, the very framework that made the victory possible, was overshadowed by the Spitfire's legend. The system worked so well that it seemed invisible, and what works invisibly is rarely remembered. Britain's salvation, so often described as divine, was in fact deeply human. Men and women synchronizing data, fuel, and courage across an island under siege. When the war ended, the story of survival became a national myth. It was told in colors and shapes that stirred pride. The Spitfire stood on pedestals, its wings symbolizing defiance. The Hurricane rusted in fields, the radar towers dismantled for scrap, the plotting rooms forgotten. The truth, that victory had been a collective computation, faded beneath the comfort of a legend that could be sung and sculpted. But the unspectacular is often the truest part of history. Britain's survival was not artistry, it was arithmetic. Not a miracle of flight, but a network of minds and machines bound by necessity. The Spitfire became the mask that history wore to make that complexity beautiful. The forgotten fighter did not lose its war. It lost its narrative. And far beyond Britain's shores, another forgotten machine was flying, one that would soon redefine what fighter meant altogether, and make every propeller-driven myth feel like the whisper of a vanished age. By 1941, German intelligence began to see what Britain had hidden in plain sight. The secret weapon was not the Spitfire, it was organization. In intercepted reports, Luftwaffe analysts noted with confusion that every British squadron seemed to appear exactly where it was needed, as if guided by invisible hands. They called it the perfect net, but it was not perfection, it was communication. The real miracle of the Battle of Britain was not mechanical, but mathematical. The chain-home radar network, those skeletal towers stretching across the coast, formed the eyes of an island that refused to be blind. Information flowed down those towers, through buried cables, into command bunkers humming with calculation. Operators, many of them women scarcely out of school, translated radar blips into coordinates. Controllers plotted flight paths with chinograph pencils, their movements measured, silent and precise. It was here, in the quiet rooms of fighter command, that Britain learned how to think faster than it could fly. From these data points, decisions rippled outward. Squadrons scrambled not at random, but at exact intervals chosen by probability. Dowding's system, now legendary but once doubted, turned air defense into a living algorithm. The fighters were its hands, the radar, its eyes, the ground crews, its heartbeat. It was the first truly digital war, long before the word existed. Fighter command won through computation, not charisma. Yet the public needed something to see, something human. The Spitfire filled that need perfectly. It was the image of defiance, a visible miracle for an invisible victory. The machine that caught the sunlight became shorthand for the entire structure that made survival possible. The myth was necessary, perhaps even merciful. Nations in crisis cannot rally around efficiency. They rally around beauty, but the irony of that beauty is what endures. The more the Spitfire's legend grew, the smaller the system beneath it became in memory. The men and women who plotted, refueled, calculated and repaired were written out of the narrative they made possible. Even Dowding himself was quietly dismissed after victory, his methodical brilliance too unemotional for peacetime storytelling. The country celebrated the roar of the Merlin engine, not the whisper of telephones linking radar stations to control rooms. Every nation in that war needed its symbol of purity amid the mud. Germany had the Messerschmitt, Japan, the Zero, America, the Mustang. These machines became moral shorthand, beauty standing in for righteousness. It was easier to worship an aircraft than to understand an organization, but the truth, like the radar signal, moved beneath the surface, unseen, constant, essential. The mythology of the Spitfire discredits what it hides. It reduces teamwork to ornament and collective genius to backdrop. Yet without that network, no amount of courage could have saved the island. The pilots who became legends were only the final link in a vast human chain, a symphony of engineers, scientists, and civilians playing in perfect synchrony. Their work was quiet, their success invisible, their story overshadowed by wings. Still, perhaps there is beauty in that too, in the humility of a nation defended not by miracles, but by coordination. The miracle was never the machine. It was the people who made 1,000 imperfect machines act as one. The Spitfire remains an icon, but the truth of air defense was never about flight. It was about connection, about minds linked across a frightened island, turning chaos into order and fear into rhythm. And beyond Britain, another country, one vast, wounded, and unyielding, was about to apply the same lesson on a scale the world had never seen. By 1943, the skies over Germany had become killing grounds. The 8th Air Force sent waves of bombers eastward each morning, fortresses of aluminum crawling through the cold, black air at 20,000 feet. Below them, the Reich stirred. The Luftwaffe climbed to meet them, hundreds of fighters rising in coordinated strikes. For the men inside the B-17s and B-24s, it felt like ritual slaughter. The numbers told the story more clearly than fear ever could. On raids against Schweinfurt and Regensburg, more than 60 bombers failed to return in a single day. Losses of 10% were considered sustainable. 20 became catastrophe. Crews counted their missions like gamblers counting breaths. Without long-range escort, every mile over Germany was a wager against mathematics. The RAF had faced this truth already. Night bombing spared them daylight losses, but not accuracy. The Americans insisted on precision raids, tight formations, clear weather, daylight visibility, and paid for that clarity in blood. Fighter escorts could only follow as far as Belgium or the Dutch coast. Beyond that lay what crews called the Black Gap, a region of sky where no friendly aircraft could reach. The Luftwaffe waited there, patient and practiced. Then, quietly, a new shape appeared on the horizon, sleek, narrow, and understated. Its name was the North American P-51 Mustang. It was not born of American genius alone. The early Mustangs, powered by Allison engines, had shown promise, but lacked the altitude performance needed for Europe's high air war. The transformation came when British engineers fitted the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine into its fuselage. Suddenly, the aircraft that had been merely adequate became extraordinary. It could climb faster than the enemy, fly farther than any escort before it, and fight on equal terms with the Luftwaffe's finest. The timing was as critical as the design. By late 1943, Germany's fuel supplies were dwindling, its aces exhausted. The P-51 arrived not as a miracle, but as the final equation solved, a synthesis of British refinement and American mass production. It was partnership made tangible, British intellect, American industry, and the quiet inevitability of collaboration. The first Mustangs over Berlin proved what no speech could. The bombers would no longer fly alone. They escorted the B-17s all the way to target and home again. For the first time, the Luftwaffe found itself hunted. Its formations, once disciplined and daring, began to fragment. German pilots, trained for offense, now fought defensively in a sky that no longer belonged to them. The press called it the fighter that won the war. The phrase was convenient and comforting. It allowed the public to believe that salvation could still come in the form of a single machine, as it had once believed in the Spitfire or the Zero. But the truth, as always, was more intricate. The P-51 did not win alone. It completed a system already in motion. Without the P-47 Thunderbolts that first cleared the way, without the P-38 Lightnings that pioneered long-range escort tactics, without the bombers that bore the brunt of learning, the Mustang would have had nothing left to save. Its legend grew because it arrived at the perfect moment, when the Allies needed proof that progress could still turn loss into advantage. Pilots loved it for its grace, ground crews for its reliability. To the men who flew in the bomber streams, the sight of silver Mustangs sliding overhead felt like deliverance. Yet behind that feeling lay the same old truth of modern war. Victory depends on the network, not the node. The P-51 was not a miracle, it was a mirror. It reflected the industrial harmony of two nations finally learning to fight as one. The British provided the intellect of design. The Americans, the scale of creation. Together, they produced an instrument of endurance that ended the Luftwaffe's dominance. Even so, the myth remained irresistible. Newspapers crowned it the savior of Europe, ignoring the factories, the engineers, and the chain of logistics that had made its existence possible. But perhaps every generation needs one machine to believe in, a vessel for its gratitude and its grief. The Mustang's beauty lay not in its lines or its victories, but in its balance, the quiet proof that collaboration, not perfection, decides survival. And in the shadows of Europe's burning skies, engineers were already sketching the outline of a new age, one where the propeller would vanish and speed itself would change the meaning of war. Every legend casts a shadow. The P-51 Mustang, hailed as the savior of Europe, was no exception. It flew with grace that seemed effortless, but behind every smooth flight lay a web of precision, fragility, and consequence. The Mustang demanded perfection. Its Merlin engine, a British heart in an American body, was a masterpiece of engineering. but it was also intolerant of error. Poor fuel could detonate cylinders. Oil too cold could seize the propeller mid-climb. A single overlooked bolt, a misaligned spark plug, or a delay in maintenance could turn brilliance into catastrophe. It was a machine that rewarded skill and punished haste. On paper, its light frame was a triumph of design. Engineers had stripped away every unnecessary kilogram to stretch its range deep into enemy territory. But every pound saved came at a cost. Armor was minimal. Fuel tanks surrounded the pilot's seat. A single cannon shell could ignite the aircraft like a matchstick. What had once been a virtue of efficiency became a vulnerability of survival. In the quiet after battle, ground crews saw what the public never did. Wings scorched black from fire, bullet holes stitched through the fuselage, cockpits empty. The aircraft that had symbolized dominance was also one of the most demanding to keep alive. Its success depended not only on the pilot's courage, but on the unbroken chain of men and women behind him, the mechanics, the fuelers, the logisticians who turned delicate precision into daily reliability. For inexperienced pilots, the learning curve was merciless. The Mustang's narrow landing gear punished rough landings. Its torque could flip the plane on takeoff. Many never reached combat. Those who did found that the same speed that made them invincible could also kill them. Diving from altitude, the control surfaces stiffened until the aircraft became unresponsive. Too steep, and it would never pull out. Too shallow, and it would never reach home. The statistics, stripped of glamour, told their own story. Thousands of Mustangs were lost not to enemy fire, but to weather, fuel exhaustion, or mechanical failure. The myth of invincibility that filled newspapers and recruiting posters was built upon a foundation of risk the public never saw. Behind every ace was a roster of men whose names faded in official reports. Pilots who fought the machine as much as the enemy. Yet for all its fragility, the P-51 endured, not because it was perfect, but because it existed within a perfect system. The Allies' logistical network stretched from British airfields to American factories, each link tuned to sustain the Mustang's appetite for precision. Fuel shipments, spare parts, engine replacements, all synchronized to an efficiency the Axis could not replicate. The Mustang's wings carried not only its own weight, but the weight of the industrial world behind it. Training evolved to match. New pilots no longer relied on instinct alone. They learned tactics measured in mathematics, altitude advantage, throttle discipline, coordinated escort patterns. The Mustang's beauty was not only in its design, but in its integration, one component in a vast, deliberate architecture of survival. The truth was simple and therefore easy to overlook. Heroism alone could not have won the air war. The Mustang's legend, like every legend before it, was built not on miracles, but on management. Its pilots flew bravely, yes, but bravery without system is only luck, and luck rarely lasts long enough to make history. Every time a formation of silver Mustangs returned from a raid over Germany, the world saw victory in motion, but beneath the gleam was a constant, invisible equation of oil pressure, engine temperature, wind correction, and fuel reserves measured to the minute. It was a triumph, not just of flight, but of discipline. And perhaps that is the hidden cost of every legend. That perfection, when seen from afar, is really just coordination seen too quickly to notice. The Mustang was brilliant, but brittle. It survived because men built a system strong enough to carry its weakness. And as that system perfected the art of sustaining flight, another generation of engineers was already dreaming of engines that would no longer need the wind at all. By 1944, the air above Europe no longer belonged to individuals. It belonged to systems. The age of the lone hero had ended. In its place rose something colder, greater, and far more enduring: orchestration. Allied air dominance was not built on the wings of a single fighter or the courage of a single pilot. It was built on a harmony of science, production, and communication that reached from factory floor to front line. The P-51 Mustang stood at the center of that harmony, the visible soloist of an invisible symphony. Its silhouette led the formations, its name filled the newspapers, its pilots were photographed against the setting sun. But behind every flight lay an infrastructure so intricate that it seemed almost organic. Radar stations tracked weather and enemy movement with the rhythm of breathing lungs. Fuel convoys pulsed across oceans. Radio operators transmitted instructions like heartbeats through the ether. In that synchronization lay the real miracle of flight: continuity. Each sortie was a calculation, not a gamble. Every pilot who lifted from a rain-soaked runway carried the product of 1,000 equations: range versus payload, altitude versus endurance, risk versus return. The Mustang could fly farther than any escort before it, but its power lay not in distance, it lay in predictability. Engineers, planners, and logisticians turned chaos into schedule, air into geometry. The result was not just air superiority, but air continuity, a sky that never slept. Factories in Britain and America worked in counterpoint. Aluminum from Pennsylvania, rubber from Malaya, engines from Derby, each component found its place in a production score that played without pause. The air war had become a machine that fed itself, an industrial organism whose rhythm grew stronger with every mission. The Mustang was only the melody. The symphony was everything that made it possible. The legend of the P-51, like that of the Spitfire or the Zero before it, told the comforting story of the singular, the idea that one perfect machine, one perfect man, could alter the course of history. It was a beautiful illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. The truth was more profound and perhaps more humbling. Victory came not from genius, but from coordination. The Mustang's legacy was not mechanical perfection. It was industrial confidence, the belief that collective organization could outperform even the most gifted individual. For the pilots, this transformation was both empowering and disquieting. They still flew with courage, but now they flew as parts of a pattern, guided by vectors, briefed by intelligence, controlled by unseen voices hundreds of miles away. The intimacy of combat had become procedural, the art of war replaced by the science of management. And yet, within that vast machinery, every life still mattered. Each pilot was a single note in an unending score, a necessary sound in the harmony of a global effort. The Symphony of the Skies reached its crescendo in 1944 and 1945. The Luftwaffe collapsed under the relentless rhythm, fuel gone, factories burning, pilots too young to remember training. The Allies, through coordination rather than innovation, had learned to sustain momentum longer than any adversary. The sky, once ruled by instinct and improvisation, had become a field of systems, and the Mustang, gleaming and efficient, was its most elegant expression. In time, the myth simplified. The public remembered the shape of the aircraft, not the pattern of its making. They remembered the roar of the Merlin engine, not the hum of the assembly line that produced it. The lie of singularity erased the orchestra that sustained it. But history, like music, is never played by one instrument alone. The P-51's true gift was not speed or range, but proof. Proof that coordination could turn frailty into dominance, that a network could achieve what no individual could endure. Even the best pilot is only a note in the score, and when the notes move in unison, the sky itself begins to sing. And as that symphony faded into jet roar, the world prepared to meet a new kind of music, faster, louder, and utterly without mercy. By 1944, the war in the air had acquired a new kind of celebrity. The age of the general was fading. The age of the ace had arrived. Newspapers printed faces beneath bold headlines, men who, it was said, had shot down 15, 20, even 40 enemy aircraft. They were the modern knights of the sky, proof that individual courage could still matter in a world increasingly ruled by machines. Their names were printed beside kill tallies like box scores, but behind those numbers lay a quieter, less flattering arithmetic. Kill counts had always been a way to measure morale more than truth. They were simple, digestible, and gloriously misleading. In the chaos of combat, verification was nearly impossible. A pilot saw his rounds strike a target, watched smoke trail behind it, and reported the aircraft destroyed. But smoke was not proof, and most battles ended far from witnesses. Many kills were merely damaged aircraft limping home. Some were already being claimed by another pilot firing from another angle. The sky, thick with confusion, became a ledger of duplicated victories. Every air force indulged the same illusion. German aces recorded hundreds of victories, numbers that strained belief but served a purpose. Each claim reinforced the myth of superiority. Japan's Zero pilots, too, became icons of martial virtue, their successes inflated by propaganda that needed heroes as much as history needed data. The Allies were not immune. American and British records, though more conservative, often counted probable kills as confirmed, if only to balance morale against mounting losses. For the men who flew, the tally was both a reward and a burden. They competed not just against the enemy, but against one another. Promotions followed numbers, fame followed claims. And yet, few spoke of the randomness that governed survival. Visibility, weather, formation, fatigue, each mattered as much as instinct. A pilot's skill could keep him alive, but only logistics could keep him in the air. Behind every ace's legend stood an unseen army of mechanics, armorers, and strategists who made flight possible. The man in the cockpit might squeeze the trigger, but the bullet was the product of a system that stretched across continents. The best pilot in the world was powerless without fuel, replacement parts, or timely intelligence. The war rewarded coordination, not charisma, yet it was charisma that the world preferred to remember. By 1944, the contradiction had become complete. The Mustang, the Spitfire, the Messerschmitt, all had become vessels for myth, their pilots the human faces of an industrial war. Propaganda painted them as artists of instinct, when in truth they were products of organization. The arithmetic of glory hid the calculus of survival. It was easier to count victories than to explain logistics. Some aces tried to correct the record after the war. Many admitted that their tallies were inflated or unverifiable. Others confessed that the system itself encouraged exaggeration, that the chaos of air combat defied quantification, yet demanded it anyway. But by then, the numbers had already hardened into legend. A pilot's reputation was not measured by endurance, but by statistics that often belonged as much to imagination as to memory. Still, one truth endures through the haze of overclaim and myth. Skill mattered, instinct mattered, but neither could overcome the realities of fuel, fatigue, or outnumbered odds. The men who lasted longest were not always the bravest, but the most disciplined, those who understood that survival was a collective act disguised as an individual triumph. In the end, numbers deceive when divorced from meaning. They tell us who shot first, not who learned fastest, who killed most, not who endured longest. The arithmetic of glory records victories, but not the cost that purchased them. Every ace was a statistic. every statistic a story, and every story a simplification of something far more complex. And soon, as jet engines screamed across a new horizon, even that arithmetic would become obsolete. Speed would outrun storytelling, and the human face of air war would begin to disappear into vapor. By 1944, the skies above the world were filled with miracles, each nation convinced it had built the machine that would end the war. In Germany, it was the Messerschmitt Me 262, the first operational jet fighter, a silver spear said to be decades ahead of its time. In Britain, the Hawker Tempest roared low over Europe, fast and fearsome, designed to hunt anything with wings. In the Pacific, America's F-6F Hellcat ruled the carrier decks, while Japan's Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate became its answer. The swift wind meant to turn back the tide. Each was a masterpiece in its moment. Each was also a mirage. The Me-262 could outrun anything in the sky, yet could not outlast the war collapsing beneath it. Fuel shortages, poor maintenance, and pilot inexperience turned it from prophecy to museum piece. The Tempest, though formidable, arrived too late to change the course already set by numbers and logistics. The Hellcat, built in the thousands, achieved dominance not through brilliance but through abundance, proof that in modern war, quantity had a quality of its own. The Ki-84, graceful and deadly, suffered from the very scarcity that defined Japan's struggle. Engines starved of fuel, airframes weakened by poor materials, dreams crushed under attrition. Each of these aircraft reflected its nation's philosophy of hope. Germany placed its faith in innovation, Britain in refinement, America in production, Japan in spirit. Yet all fell before the same quiet adversary, time. No advantage lasted long enough to matter. By the time a design reached perfection, the war had moved on. The future always arrived faster than the factory could adapt. In the race for superiority, nations pushed their machines beyond human endurance. Engines demanded higher octane than refineries could provide. Airframes outflew the stamina of their pilots. Mechanics worked without rest, patching masterpieces that needed miracles to stay aloft. Each innovation raised expectations faster than reality could sustain them. What emerged from this cycle was a truth that few recognized in the moment. Survival belonged not to the fastest or the fiercest, but to the most balanced. The aircraft that endured, the Spitfire, the Mustang, the Hellcat, were not flawless. They were reliable. They could be built quickly, flown by many, repaired easily. Their secret was not superiority, but sustainability. War, in the end, is not a contest of toys, but of systems. A single aircraft, no matter how advanced, cannot change a war fought on continents and oceans. The jet age was dawning, but its promise arrived too late for the pilots who still fought and died in propeller-driven machines. The future was already visible, but it could not yet be used. The myth of technological salvation hides the real engine of victory: endurance. It is built not from speed, but from supply lines, not from innovation, but from adaptation. Every nation that sought to leap ahead found itself falling back, caught between invention and exhaustion. The machines were magnificent, but they consumed their makers faster than they defeated their enemies. By 1945, every air force on Earth had learned the same lesson. Brilliance fades, balance survives. In the final accounting, no aircraft remained unbeatable, only unforgotten. The true superiority belonged not to the miracle, but to the mechanism that could keep flying long after miracles failed. And as the last propellers slowed to silence, another kind of machine was preparing to rise, one that would render every lesson of the piston age both complete and obsolete. The greatest lies in aviation were never born of malice. They were born of need. In a world collapsing under the weight of fear, nations required stories to hold themselves together. The myths of the sky, the perfect fighter, the invincible ace, the machine that could not fail, were the scaffolding of morale. They gave people something to believe in while the ground beneath them burned. Governments printed those stories as easily as they printed posters. Aircraft became symbols of hope. Pilots became saints in leather helmets. The reality, fatigue, failure, and fear was left behind the hangar doors. But in the act of deception, there was also preservation. To endure war is to live with contradiction, to see the truth and still choose belief. The men who flew those machines were not fooled by their own myths, not entirely. They understood how thin the difference was between mastery and luck, between a functioning engine and a silent one. Yet they needed the illusion as much as the civilians below. It gave shape to courage. When they spoke of their aircraft as if it were alive, they were not lying. They were reminding themselves that something in this mechanical world still felt loyal, still answered to human hands. Every nation built its myths differently. Japan called its pilots divine, Germany invincible, Britain noble, America liberating. But the truth that lay beneath was the same everywhere. Exhaustion, sacrifice, the gradual erosion of certainty. The war in the air was not sustained by superiority, but by faith. Faith in machines that were flawed, in missions that were uncertain, in causes that often blurred. Belief, even when mistaken, kept men flying when reason alone might have told them to stop. Yet history has a quieter truth, and it is the one that outlives them all. Adaptation beats arrogance. Every victory in the sky came not from invulnerability, but from the willingness to change, to rebuild, to relearn, to admit error. The nations that endured were those that learned faster than they broke. Air power's real triumph was not dominance, but flexibility, the ability to evolve under fire. For every legend that claimed perfection, there was a forgotten story of correction. Engineers modifying designs overnight, crews improvising repairs with scraps, commanders rewriting doctrine between missions. Progress was not made in leaps, but in adjustments. The myth said that machines made history. The truth was that people did, by learning to learn. And when the war finally ended, those same myths took on gentler meanings. The Spitfire, the Mustang, the Zero, each became a mirror, reflecting not what their nations were, but what they needed to remember. Courage, unity, sacrifice. The machines outlived the men, but the legends outlived the machines. They were not accurate, but they were necessary. Fragments of faith in a world learning how to rebuild. We call them heroes, but they were human, afraid, determined, fallible, and that is what makes their story greater still. Their courage was not born from invincibility, but from the understanding that they were not. The final lesson of air power is not flight, it is endurance, the strength to rise, fall, and rise again. And as the jet age dawned, sweeping away the myths of propellers and pistons, one truth remained constant. The sky changes, but the human heart does not.